Afternoon, and welcome to BALT, How to Provide Support to Grassroots Organization. This session, we will be responding to a couple of the questions that have arisen during the time that you all have provided support, cohorts 1 and 2 and 3, I believe, Iman.
Yeah, we just had 2, 3 starts in January.
Yep, so what will be 3. So cohorts 1 and 2, providing support for grassroots organizations. And as a part of that support, there have been a number of questions that have arisen around the scope of the work, the structure of the work, and the way to go about providing support to grassroots organizations. So in that vein, we're having this webinar to discuss some of the issues that have come up, to think about a framework for structuring representation or support for grassroots organizations, and what that looks like in the work that you're doing with BALT, as well as your prior experiences or current experiences with working with organizational clients, particularly clients that are grassroots organizations. You'll advance the slide. So just in terms of an overview of the session, the screen isn't showing up so great, but the overview for today's session is really for us to introduce ourselves, the presenters as well as the participants, and then to talk a little bit about the goals of the webinar, to then move from that to what do we mean when we say grassroots organizations? What are the kinds of issues that you are seeing? All of this in the context of representing organizations as distinct from representing individuals. And then what are the kinds of problems and issues that grassroots clients bring to us? And we will use Professor Bennet's framework of a complex or ill-structured problem, and think about problem solving in that context. Professor Hatcher will then talk to us a little bit about power-based approaches to client representation and a couple of tools that she provided that you received earlier. And then we will talk just generally about what are some of the common challenges and opportunities that you have seen in organizational representation, and particularly in the representation of the clients within the cohort. So that is the focus of today's session, and we will proceed in that order. Okay, so just really quick, today's panelists are Renee Hatcher, who's an assistant professor at the John Marshall Law School, and Renee is the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic there. We also are joined by Professor Susan Bennet, who is a professor of law at Washington College of Law at American University and directs the Community Development Clinic there. And myself, Dorcas Gilmore, I am a visiting associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Law, directing the Small Business and Community Equity Development Clinic. So the three of us today will bring approaches from working with grassroots clients and organizational clients for the past anywhere from 10 to 30 years of doing this work, and some of the approaches that we have used and challenges that we faced in doing this work. Okay, so I wanted to just give Susan and Renee an opportunity to say a little bit more about kind of the work with Grassroots clients, or anything that they would like to add.
Okay, hi, this is Susan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Dorcas, and Iman for organizing this and for including all of us. As do my colleagues, I teach about problem solving and working with grassroots organizations in the context of assisting students to develop an outlook of community lawyering. And so that's challenges imposed on top of challenges because they don't really have experience as in any kind of lawyering. So in some ways that's better. They don't have a lot of preconceptions other than what law school delivers upon them. Some ways it's harder. I think that the small organizations that we work with are small. Sometimes they work in coalitions, but more often than not, they are cooperatives of different kinds, workers or housing cooperatives. There are a lot of housing cooperatives for affordable housing in the district. And I think the issues always with representing clients is certainly ones you're all familiar with, I imagine, trying to figure out which voice most, I'm going to say dependably, if not accurately, represents the ongoing will of the client. Flexibility, which I think both lawyers need working with clients, and clients hopefully have working with lawyers. We ask a lot of clients, I think, when we work with them. I think a big challenge is sort of like keeping your eye on the goal and not getting all messed up in the weeds of the intermediate issues that are strategies rather than solutions. So I think that the classic one for our students and our clients is doing the bylaws for a client. That's a strategy. It's a capacity building exercise. There are many ways to think about it. In and of itself, it's not a goal. It's a goal. The goal is to assist the client in making its voice as productive and efficient as possible in achieving its goals. And so I think that in these complex problems that our clients come to us with, to sort of sorting out the problem that is solvable, the goal and the strategy is always kind of challenging. I'll just stop there.
Excellent. So that is exactly what we'll be talking about. And that framework of problem, goal, and strategy is something that I know the lawyers on this call, working with members of the cohort, have really grappled with. So we will continue to talk about that. Renee?
Can you all hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Now we can.
Okay, I'm unmuted officially. I direct a clinic at John Marshall Law School called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. We represent solidarity economy enterprises and organizations and other kinds of enterprises and organizations in the greater Chicagoland area, working on a range of issues. And I think some of my challenges are similar to what both Susan and Dorcas kind of laid out in working with grassroots organizations. And particularly in the law school setting, it can be challenging. I think so much of this work really requires us to invest deeply in relationships with our clients and figure out exactly what does that look like, and not necessarily, I think, perhaps certainly what at least some of my students envision as the attorney-client relationship, but really the need to dig deep to build authentic relationships with clients, to build trust, which are all things that I'm sure you as practicing attorneys have had, different experiences with. I think what's really wonderful about this work is that you have opportunities not only just to look to be forward thinking, and whether that's drafting bylaws for an organization or participating in strategy sessions around a campaign that a grassroots organization is currently putting on. I think there's a lot to both be gained by bringing legal support to that conversation, but also to be learned for us as attorneys. So I find, at least in the work that we do, is that I learn as much, if not more, from my clients than certainly from any of the other, I think, traditional spaces that we think of as lawyers to go to for information. And so I would just encourage everyone to be open to that, to think about the kinds of privilege that we come in with as lawyers, even those of us coming from some of the communities that are represented by our clients. I think that there is inherently something that is a privilege that's created, right, by becoming the attorney or walking into the room as an attorney, even though you might not necessarily always feel like that's the hat you want to put on. But, you know, that's something I think constantly to be conscious of as we try to really help to provide support to grassroots organizations. What does that mean, and can we participate in ways that actually are going to further their goals? And then I think capacity is always an issue, certainly for grassroots organizations. Sometimes on working on different campaigns, things are never very straightforward. So constantly, I think, figuring out the relationship, like what can you offer in terms of legal support that they didn't necessarily teach you in law school? How can you be creative and not necessarily allow our legal education to limit how we think about problem solving in these instances, I think is also a really important issue. But I think what's key is certainly relationships, trying to really, as Susan said, kind of keep your eye on the larger goal, and then think about what are the ultimate strategies to get us there.
Okay, so thank you both. And just because we've had some new folks join us, I'm just going to kind of summarize what you all have highlighted as key elements in thinking about grassroots, representing and supporting grassroots organizations. And so Susan talked about clarity around the difference between a problem, a goal, and a strategy, and how to ensure that we're actually moving toward the client's goal as opposed to being narrowly focused on a particular strategy, and how to not get caught in the weeds of the strategy as opposed to the goal advancement. She also highlighted the importance of relationships, which Renee continued in talking about the importance of building trust in grassroots organizations and organizational representation, the ability to dig deep, to think forward, and to learn from our clients' experiences, and to see our clients as partners in the work and assets themselves. And in all of that, what we are talking about is shifting power. And so how do we really think about power shifting at the center of this work? And that power shifting then requires our own investigation and continual focus on the privilege that we bring as we do this work, and how that impacts the work that we do for and with our clients. So I'll pause there. Did I miss anything, Keith? Two of you? Okay, I think I'm getting head nods, so I'll move forward with that as a good enough summary thus far. And I think I will provide my comments in the context of going through the initial slides. And so if you all could just introduce yourselves really quickly with your name, organizational affiliation, the organization and BALT that you have provided the most support for, and again, briefly, the key challenge with working with grassroots organization in this context or in general. So I'm just going to read off the screen as I see it so that we can move fast. Deb, I'm starting with you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Deborah Gardner. I am the legal director at the Public Justice Center in Baltimore. The organization that I worked most closely with in cohort 1 of the Brain Trust is Red Wagon. I also did some work for LBS. And I'll say one key challenge I found sort of related to how to effectively do community lawyering was learning better how to advise the organization and let go of what decision they made once I had given them the best legal advice I could give them about their options and the ramifications of different choices they might make. And then it's up to them to decide what, if any, risks they might want to take. And it's not up to me to insist that they choose some sort of risk-free option and in particular, not up to me to insist that they choose an option that aligns with the mission of my organization. For example, they started with an employment agreement that wanted to try to make people independent contractors that weren't really legally independent contractors. And I sort of advised them, and they took that from other organizations that they had found in their networks and online. And so I advised them about the ramifications, and but I had to let go of the idea that in our workplace justice project, we could never support an organization that was going to do something that was from our perspective unlawful civilly, and just let them decide what they wanted to do. And that all worked out fine, but it was an interesting challenge for me to sort of learn how to navigate that.
Thank you, Deb. That is always an interesting challenge. Yeah, I never thought I would represent employers, but in the context of providing general counsel for community-based organizations and for small businesses, I find myself in that position, and it's a good one to be in most of the time. So yes, this is definitely an issue. Okay, so I am not sure if I'm going to say your name correctly. Nena, is that correct or incorrect?
Yes, yeah, it's Nena.
That's right. Okay, excellent. Okay, please.
Yeah, my name is Nena Amuchi. I'm an organizer with BYP 100 in DC. I am barred in California. I'm in the process of waiving into DC, and I'm just trying to get more involved in movement lawyering. So I saw this email, so I'm on here. I don't know who's in the cohort of BALT. But yeah, I am part of a grassroots organization, so trying to wear multiple hats within that.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you for joining us. Jen?
Hi. Yeah, I am Jen Ubiera. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm looking, where are the questions? My organizational affiliation, I am with Law for Black Lives DC, and the organization in the BALT cohort that we work with most closely is BALT. And Iman and I talked about the cohort, but we haven't done anything additional with BALT. Oh yeah, well, we did the Black Mamas Bailout. And then the key challenge in working with grassroots organizations, I would say from Law for Black Lives DC specifically, we've experienced issues with timeliness and consistency from our side with the attorneys keeping up. You know, someone mentioned the importance of the relationship building, like deepening those relationships and those happening through trust. And so we've been taking that very seriously in the last year. And so I would trying to be consistent in how we distribute tasks and how we, you know, get things back. And I would say that that is a challenge because we ourselves are a collective. We're not a nonprofit. We don't have we have a kind of like we try to have a decentralized structure, and that doesn't always necessarily support what we're doing in collaboration with organizations. So yeah, that's what we've experienced as a challenge here.
Excellent, thank you. Davina?
Hi, this is Davina Ugochukwu, and I've worked most closely with LBS and Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And I think, well, a little bit about me is that I am pretty much an independent contractor in the DC area as I build my nonprofit. So I'm also a founder of a nonprofit that I'll soon be launching. I think the biggest struggle for me with working with grassroots communities in this way, I'm used to working with grassroots communities kind of like on a fellowship basis, or I'm interning, so my full attention and my full time is there. But I think doing it kind of in tandem with like my daily life, that was a little difficult when you have like really crazy 100-hour weeks or family emergencies. And that's more like on the logistical side. I think some of the other things that I found a little bit difficult was kind of pinpointing exactly what the organization itself needed, and trying to figure out if I was making their time with me as useful as possible. So making sure that I'm not, I don't know how to say it, but like sometimes it felt like there were some things that where I wanted to make sure that as an attorney, I was providing my legal skills, whereas that is not what it always seemed like they needed in a way. And so just kind of pinpointing exactly what was needed, when it was needed, not when it was needed, but what was needed and how to make sure that I'm achieving that. I think that was a little bit of the difficulty. And I know that kind of comes in with when you're a nonprofit and you're dealing with so many things, you know, you don't have necessarily like the same team that a for-profit business would have, so, or organization would have. So I know that it comes with just today, you know, yeah, we said that we needed this, but something else happened, and, you know, you're going with the flow of things. So, yeah, that's about it.
Well, thank you all. You just highlighted a number of things that we will be talking about on this webinar, particularly the kind of pinpointing what the organization needs and what does it mean to use legal skills. And I would just say that I don't think that it's a nonprofit issue. That it really is about size of organization, and whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, it's of very little consequence. It really is about the capacity and size of the organization. There are very large nonprofits in Baltimore. You always use the example of Johns Hopkins is a nonprofit organization and is, you know, would not have these challenges at all. But yeah, so it's more about size, capacity, and the complexity of the issues that the organization is trying to address, which is part of what we'll be talking about today. Okay, so thank you all for your introductions. And Iman, just because we have folks who are in the cohort and folks who are not in the cohort on the call, could you just give like the 2-sentence overview of what the cohort is and what BALT is doing?
Yeah, so the cohort started because we had a workshop training, I want to say the end of 2017, and one of the major takeaways that we got from the activists in Baltimore was that we need to expand the capacity of community lawyers to help grassroots organizations. And so kind of as a follow-up to that, we came up with the brain trust, or the legal brain trust idea, where we would ask organizations and attorneys or legal workers to apply to be a part of it. And we would have a cohort. So the cohorts, we have 2 right now. There are 8 attorneys and 4 organizations. And, the organizations were responsible for applying and explaining or describing their policy or legal issue. And the attorneys had to kind of do the same thing and explain, and they had to apply and explain their experience working with grassroots organizations. The time frame was 8-month period. And we had a myriad of organizations apply. And the first cohort, I think, like I was telling someone, I think the first cohort, the reason why we chose those specific organizations is because they had very discrete policy issues. Whereas the second cohort, we chose organizations that supported one population, and their projects were not as distinct as the first. And so we definitely saw, differences in just how the attorneys struggled to support them. And so that was kind of why we decided to do this, because we acknowledge that it can be, just the way that we learn the law as attorneys, it can be a stretch sometimes. And so that was how we decided to come up with this webinar. Did I leave anything else out, Dorcas?
Nope.
Okay.
That's it. And so Iman and I are 2 of the 5 co-founders of the Baltimore Action Legal Team. And from that conversation came that part of the struggle is the struggle of individual representation versus organizational representation. And a lot of the things that we were hearing were felt very common to me in thinking about those distinctions, right? And that lawyers are generally trained to represent individuals, whether it is in civil or administrative or criminal matters. Almost none of law school outside of a clinical context prepares lawyers to be to represent organizations. So that was the point of this, was to do kind of high level focus on organizational representation, and particularly grassroots organization representation. So the goals of this webinar are to identify some of the shared features of grassroots organization, connect those characteristics to organizational representation, to identify and discuss some of the key elements and distinctions in organizational representation, and then to have a discussion around the skills, approaches, and tools to working with grassroots organizations. So that's what we're hoping to do. And we're going to start with just an overview of common characteristics of grassroots organizations in the framework of questions. And so we hope that this will be a conversation throughout. So just high level, when we talk about grassroots organizations, what are we talking about? As I just mentioned, they could come in a variety of forms, right? So grassroots doesn't necessarily mean nonprofit. There are a range, as the folks in the cohort know, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is not organized, right, as a nonprofit organization. They're organized as a limited liability company, and they did that on purpose. And they very much would consider themselves a grassroots advocacy organization, right? So the meaning of grassroots is really about, and these are my thoughts, my observations of doing this work past 15 years or so, but lots of people have other experiences. So please add, challenge, etc. In representing grassroots organizations, some of the common characteristics that I would highlight is a commitment to achieving social change that places those who are most impacted by whatever the problem or issue is at the forefront of addressing the challenge. The grassroots part, that's not always the case, right? But that is often a common feature, that it's those who are being impacted by a problem self-organizing and advocating for their own interests. The self-organization could be by geography, so by neighborhood, by block, by area of the city. It could be based on political viewpoint, like LBS, for example. It could be social category, race, religion, gender. It could be focused on a particular issue, etc. And that the idea of grassroots is that there is some attention to power and the way that power plays out and has played out in those various social contexts, and that the organization is responding and advocating based on that issue, right? Whatever the shared issue is. And often, particularly the organizations that we're talking about in the cohort, there's some element of movement, which is to say that the organization sees itself as not only kind of one organization doing one thing, but as a part of a group of organizations or a strategy approach to affecting change. Again, not always the case, particularly at the neighborhood level. A grassroots organization, my experience, might be kind of narrowly focused on whatever their particular thing is, their block, or their improvement association, or whatever the case might be. But there is this idea of self-organization, and through self-organization, creating change. So I'll pause there. Renee, Susan, would you want to add anything?
Unmute here. Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Dorcas, those things are really insightful. I think one of the challenges that we've certainly seen in working with smaller organizations, at the neighborhood or block or building level, is trying to help them develop the capacity to join in a movement. It's just it's hard enough doing what they do, but sort of thinking through with them that they might be more successful, more powerful if they join with others, might learn. It seems like a very important thing to try to do.
Renee?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. Maybe once we start talking about representing grassroots organizations, that figures in.
Okay, would anyone else add anything to what we've talked about to date in terms of their experiences representing grassroots organizations or providing support to grassroots organizations in terms of common characteristics?
I guess one thing I would say, I mean, I would see, you know, as you laid that out, I think, which is really on point, Dorcas, is I see grassroots organizations that are grounded in communities, however they define what that community is. And so in a way, you know, they may or may not be organizations that have a constituency, But more often than not, they have some constituency that they're trying to organize with, but that can look different.
Got it. Yep.
This is Deb. I'll add one thing that I'm not sure is necessarily characteristic of all grassroots organizations, but does seem common and presents another set of tremendous challenges, which is being extremely strapped in terms of capacity and resources, and
Yep.
wanting to take on so much work, and then really struggling to be able to do that work and accomplish goals with so little.
Definitely. Definitely. And that is a challenge, both in terms of part of what Susan was talking about strategy versus goal, is how I have seen it show up. So even executing a strategy on the larger goal can take an outsized amount of time and energy and resources, because the organization might be completely volunteer, for example, right? Or might only have one staff person, or might have a very limited budget, and therefore the amount of time and energy devoted to a strategy might take a much longer amount of time. So yes, that is definitely a key issue. And it's something we're going to talk about a little more in just a second. Anything else? Okay. So one of the, just in terms of framework, some of the things that we commonly have as a very legitimate question with organizational representation is, who is the client? And for folks who are more familiar with individual representation, it seems like, some kind of like theoretical academic exercise. But if you are familiar with representing organizations, you know that this is very much a challenge, right? Which is to say, who is the client at any given moment, right? And I wonder if in some of the challenges that you found in the cohort, if some of that stems from this question. So for example, for me, I'll say, I was in-house at the NAACP for 3.5 years. And at any time, I was not always sure. I knew what the organization's goals were. I could rattle them off. High capacity organization as far as this kind of thing goes. But depending upon who I was talking to, meant that the client looked a little different, right? If I am talking to the CFO, that's a very different position than if I'm talking to a local branch president that wants to do X, Y, and Z, and they're a volunteer, right? Who the client is in either of those contexts is very different, even though obviously I'm supposed to be representing the NAACP. In the context of a small organization, my experience with it is often you're talking about people who are founders of organizations. And I think in a lot of the instances in the cohort, you were working with the folks who founded the organization. And particularly when that's the case, it's how distinct is the founder's view of what the organization is from the organization's view, the broader organization's view of what the organization is and what its goals are. And that tension, right? not always tension, but sometimes tension. So that question is often at the forefront, and something that even when you have a client representative, as you have in the cohort, is a question that begs being asked, particularly after having done research and understanding like what the organization's goals are. Was that an issue for anyone who was in the cohort? Like, just as you were getting advice and connecting with the client representative, kind of really understanding who the client was? Or was that less of the issue? Or was it more capacity challenges?
Well, I have plenty of stories about this question is such a central question. So for example, in my clinic, that's the first question I always have all the students start from, like, do you know who your client is? Because even though you think you know, it's not always straightforward, particularly when you're working with clients that might be newer or startups, or maybe in your instance, even doing policy work with your clients. I know that's something that's recently come up for me quite a bit. So working on perhaps a law reform project with a organizational partner, but then realizing that the law reform that we are working on doesn't necessarily, we have yet to actually get everyone's input who will be most affected by the project that we're working on. So even in issues of policy reform, I think this can come up. Certainly in direct representation also, so many times, for example, if you know who the client is, if it's an organization or if it's a smaller enterprise, community-based enterprise, they still might not necessarily have a very clear process to make decisions. So who do you take direction from as their attorney? They don't necessarily, the secret about organizational clients is that they're made up of a lot of people, or numerous people, right? And people don't necessarily always agree or have different ideas. And so sometimes there's quite a lot of process, sometimes tension, and even trying to understand what the goals of the organization are that you are working on and forwarding through your legal work, but also who you take direction from. And so, that becomes why process becomes a strategy, right? And also a tool to make sure that the organization is moving forward in the ways that they want to move forward, or that they, collectively agree to.
So Jen, it looked like you were about to come off of mute. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would, 1 second. Yeah, I would say for us, our client, we don't necessarily represent folks. We consider ourselves more like a resource to the grassroots organizations that we're working with. So like when we're talking about policy, like if we are asked to do, the model that we work from is like when we're asked to do something, policy research or advocacy or jail support, or right now with our membership building, we're doing capacity building so that we can refer attorneys and train them around movement lawyering so that they can better support organizations directly, because we try to do like this decentralized model. Our client, I don't even know if that's like a question that we could answer, but I guess if we had to, it would be the organizers. Not even so much the organizations, because sometimes the organizers have specific needs that are related to their work in the community that we try to support as a collective of lawyers. Yep. So I know that may look different. I don't really hear that very often, and I get it because it's like we're a collective. We're not necessarily an organization of lawyers, but and that's just the DC, not Law for Black Lives National, which is separate, right, and distinct from us.
Right. But so actually, it does come up a lot, right? Like this idea of providing support, I think it's one of the issues that is frankly similar to a founder issue, which is that the organizers, right, have a particular viewpoint on whatever they're organizing around. And I think the question is, like, in providing support, is the organization, whether it's Law for Black Lives DC or BALT or whatever configuration, is it just being clear, right, about, is it providing support to the organizers or is it providing support to the effort, right? And that those things can be distinct. They can be the same thing, but there are lots of times where they can be at tension, right? And so, you know, how do we think about that throughout the support or representation? Yeah, I know, Renee, you've done a lot of work with organizers, as have you, Susan, in the tenant context as well. Any other thoughts around that?
I mean, one of the things that might be useful, so my clinic has been working with Law for Black Lives for the last maybe year and a half or so, and essentially Law for Black Lives is playing a facilitating role in connecting us with organizers or organizations in different parts of the country. And, you know, sometimes that's very straightforward. I mean, typically what happens is that they ask for a set of whether it's legal research or whether it's certain deliverables, or just we want to figure this question out at the outset of the semester. And it seems in some instances to be straightforward in the sense that all we have to do is answer this question: what does the law have to bear on this question, or what does policy say, whatever. But it actually, at least I find as we dig into it, it becomes a little bit more complex than that. One, in understanding the context. Two, in understanding what they actually want to do with that information and how they see it as moving forward, like whatever the larger picture is. And so what I find is helpful is probably to have the most possible interaction and context with clients. But there have been instances, as I mentioned a little bit before, where there did seem to be tensions between like the larger movement and maybe some specific either individuals in specific organizations or particular maybe parts or campaigns, right, that didn't necessarily seem to really push the larger movement. And sometimes it's about process, sometimes it's about context. And sometimes I think they're just like those internal tensions between, especially in coalition work, which is, I think, has been a recurring theme for us. But there can be tensions that come up in that. And so trying to really figure out, like, at least from your perspective, who your client is and what you're trying to achieve, or who you're obligated to essentially take direction from is useful. And also something that we usually revisit during the course of representation.
Yeah, so I think whether it's a client relationship or a formal client relationship or not, it's like the question of who are you actually accountable to? And is the accountability to the organizer, is the accountability to the larger organization or coalition, et cetera? Susan?
Yeah, I think some of it is also in how the client sees you. I think that we see organizers the most in the tenant organizing context, and which then morphs into the housing co-op organizing context, just because of the way those structures work in the District of Columbia. And it's very common that it's the organizer who has been with the group from the inception, helped with the initial stages of formation, helped with because it's very technical and very process based on how you move, how you own your home if you're in a rental building in the district. And so the lawyers may come in, if at all, at a point where it seems like it's very, very technical, which is when the financing is necessary, and both to acquire the building, to do renovations, to do pre-development, to do permanent financing. And that's, then the lawyer becomes a technician, very much so. And building the deep relationships and figuring out how the organizer's skills and the organizer's relationship can complement what the lawyer does is really, really challenging, I think. I'm sure that there are analogs to this in a lot of different kinds of practices. I mean, I see it from one sort of narrow slice of the sort of work that we do, but I mean, I certainly, that triad of organizer, client, organizer, lawyer, I don't think it's ever an easy one, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. You need a lot of openness, I think, if you're the lawyer, because lawyers are used to being in charge.
Got it. So I think, so Imani stopped sharing slides. She had to move to, and so I'm going to try to talk and share slides, which I'm clearly having a challenge with right now. So let me try to do this. Okay. Okay. So in the who is the client, a lot of the pieces that we already talked about, right? What are the client's goals? How are we clear on that? And that we keep coming back to it, as Renee and Susan have mentioned, right? That it's something that is not a static question, because the client's goals actually might shift over the course of time that you're working with them. And so how do you build into your support for organizations, really checking in on a regular basis on what is the goal now, and has that shifted? The other piece that's really key is what's the context the client is operating in to achieve its goals. And so by that, in that we're talking about movements to affect change, it really is thinking about what's the political context, as well as the client's history and ability to affect change over time. And then this capacity piece has come up a lot. So it's what are the challenges and opportunities that the client has to achieve the goals that it wants to achieve. And thinking about that in terms of its organization, its internal organization, as well as thinking about social capital, financial capital. So all of the things that clients want to do at some point in time take having allies, and take some level of financial resources. And so understanding what is the client's capacity, and then time is another piece that definitely needs to be discussed, right? So if we were talking about time, allies, internal organization, the clients, so human resources, who are the people that the client has to be able to assist them either in the organization or outside of the organization, and understanding where the client sits on all of those things, right, in order to achieve a particular goal. So those are some of the initial conversations with clients that checking in with them on over time is particularly important with organizational representation. Have folks kind of asked questions about context and capacity at the outset, and checked in on those things, like what has worked? Anybody?
Hello, sorry, my this is Davina. My screen froze. But I think one thing that was really helpful for us, and I apologize for misspeaking earlier, calling LBS a nonprofit. But thank you, Dorcas, for clarifying that. But one thing I think was really helpful was after we did, I think we were a few months in earlier this year, and we asked whether the work we had produced up until then was helpful. You know, it gave LBS a chance to kind of get back to us with kind of some things that didn't work and some things that did work. And it just reminding me, I mean, what you're saying just reminded me exactly of checking in, but we were able to like have a product kind of and like say, well, this is what we have. How do you like it? And getting feedback on how to move forward for the rest of the 8 months that we were working with them. And kind of, I think it also became more clear on the path that we should take a little bit in some ways, and trying to really get down to what was needed and how what was needed should be presented, if that makes sense.
It does.
Okay. And so for me personally, it's weird. It was a learning curve because usually, you know, you're told, write this memo, you write the memo, and that's that. But for this, it was like, we did the things, and then, okay, those things were kind of helpful, but I think it might be helpful to do it this way. So, yes.
Yeah, so that process, so another element of organizational representation is that it's more iterative, right? So if I move to the next slide, it's kind of what you're talking about. And it's part of the complexity or ill-structured nature of this work that we're talking about, right? So, and so that is to say, and this is borrowing from Professor Bennett's article, that the complexity comes in that there isn't necessarily a clear rule, right, or structure around whatever the client is bringing to you, that there's the need for innovation or creativity or and working with the client on that, that the timeline might start out as one thing and then it gets extended, or at times it gets accelerated, and it moves back and forth, right, depending upon what the client goals are, depending upon what the political moment is, etc. And that in a lot of instances, there isn't the law, right? They're usually in all of the kinds of projects, particularly in cohort 2, there are multiple laws. There's not the law. There are multiple things that are intersecting, that are related to one another. And some of what the client is hoping to figure out, or the organization is hoping to figure out, and that you as a lawyer are trying to figure out, is kind of what laws make sense, what policies make sense, how do these things fit together, and then what are the permutations of relationships that are at play currently and that will assist in making sure that this is something that is useful to the client. So Susan, I tried to do a real quick. So would you add anything in terms of thinking about, particularly in the LBS situation that you just described, like you delivered a product and then there was like this iterative process with the client. And what I'm wondering about is the space before you delivered the product, right? And how you actually thought about what the work was, and often that's a real challenge for lawyers, frankly. Like when the space when there isn't a thing that the client is looking at to respond to. So Susan, do you want to talk a little bit more about the ill-structured or complex?
Sure. To say, I wish I could take credit for coining ill-structured problem. That's a really old term, along with complex problem and wicked problem, and the idea of defining a solvable problem, which means you don't aim too, you're not too concrete, but on the other hand, you assess all the issues that you've already mentioned concerning capacity, social capital, financial capital, and time of the client in terms of helping to define the problem that can be solved by the client with the resources that it has. Again, not getting diverted by issues of strategy or very technical steps, but always seeing the reachable goal. I think that's this. I like the idea of thinking about these things as these processes as iterative, because it does really feel that the problem-solving space is never. I wouldn't say the problem is never solved. So maybe we should stop thinking about these things as problems and thinking of them as, I don't know, remedies, something more affirmative, stuff, things that need to be done, and because there's always more to do. And so then defining what can be done in stages, I think, is just a huge challenge. And I wish I had some answers. I think we struggle with the frameworks that are imposed on our clients and on us because of some very, very concrete things that need to be done, and trying to make sure that those frameworks don't define the client and don't define the problem. So that means keeping the space really open, which is hard, and not amenable to timelines. And it's sure not amenable to an 8.5-month semester, an 8.5-month academic year.
So can you tell me a little bit about the space before you delivered a concrete product to LBS, how you were thinking about it and how the team worked on it? We lost her. Okay. I think we'll have to forego that. All right. So in thinking about the problem solving of complex issues, so Susan and Renee, you both talked about holding space for problem identification and problem solving and the lawyer's roles in that. So if you could just share kind of how you hold space, how do you engage and make sure that the process is an iterative process, and what are some of the roles that you have played in that process?
This is hard.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll start.
Do you want to? Okay.
This is hard to think over, 30 years.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start. I'd say in terms of problem identification, what I have done is really built it in at multiple stages of the representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one, not feeling like there's this one meeting where I'm identifying all the problems, right? Or identifying what the client's issue is, but like saying at an initial meeting that this is likely to shift and change, right, over time. And because of that, we'll check in. And the check-in at the beginning of each meeting is then, kind of, is this still the challenge? Is this still the opportunity? Is this still where we're going? And kind of understanding where the client is there. And kind of just saying that this is something that we'll need to continue to hold over time, right? And as I'm doing the work, it's all with these assumptions. So I also, in documents, lay out assumptions, right? So that's also an opportunity to think about whether I'm right or not on what the client's really trying to do, and whether what I've built in to my assumptions actually still makes sense for the client. So those are two strategies that I try to use, like one that's in writing and the other is just like at every meeting with a client, there's like a check-in at the beginning of the meeting. And part of the check-in is around not just like updates, but like where are we in the course of the representation and what has happened that might have shifted, you know, goal A versus goal B, et cetera.
Yeah, and you know, just hearing, I mean, so I think that those are techniques too that I try to use and get my students to use as well, Dorcas. And I wonder if, when you mention assumptions, if really assumptions might be more like conditions, current conditions, based off of, you know, what the client's goals are. And what I mean by that is like what you think to be true in terms of moving forward and achieving the client's goals, not necessarily because we've assumed it to be so, but in part because this is just what we know. This is the limited amount of information we have in the context of achieving the client's goals, right? I think that that's really important because, as you mentioned, like things are never static. Like sometimes clients' goals are not static in that way, but also we know that like material conditions in terms of achieving clients' goals are not necessarily static. There can be changes in the law that might affect essentially what you advise the client on, or there could be different kinds of political shifts and social conditions that move that might make things more difficult or more easy for a client to achieve their goals. So I think, certainly I think those are ways to do problem identification. I think sometimes in working with power building clients, part of that work is also trying to identify points of leverage. And that can be, there can be a lot of legal research that goes into that. There can be a lot of like understanding different processes that are set up, whether it be things like zoning or whether it be things like how do you get an ordinance passed or how do you get something overturned in the state legislature. And so, you know, those sometimes are conversations where we're doing problem identification and really trying to figure out like how do we achieve the larger client's goals and like what are the layers perhaps to get to the big goal, like what are the different steps and what's the path perhaps to get there, because it's not necessarily, you know, just doing one thing and getting it done. So I think that's also how problem identification comes in, trying to do some power mapping, trying to identify points of leverage, and then problem solving. I'm not sure if you all ever I use the GOCD framework that I imagine Susan has used at least at one point, which is trying to identify the goals. So GOCD stands for goals, options, consequences of those options, and then the decision. And I use that as a problem solving kind of framework for the students to use, but just in thinking about lawyering generally and thinking about problem solving and really trying to flesh out and be creative to make sure that we're not missing different options that might be on the table that aren't as apparent or straightforward. So I find that to be helpful. And I think the lawyer's role can sometimes look different. It depends on the client, and sometimes like how the client wants to engage, if it's more of a partnership or if it's more, you know, there's strict things that you're trying to get done or deliverables. But I find all of this like to be iterative and really trying to make sure that we're checking in not only about the client's goals or the problem identification, how's the problem changed, but also like what are the material conditions that we're working in, because that's just as important.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting and critical to check in on consistently from the minute the client comes with whether it's a particular problem or something broader, is different ideas that both lawyers and clients have about what the other can or will do. And I think our clients, and I certainly experienced this in the individual client representation, our clients in housing think that what lawyers do is landlord-tenant law when it comes to housing, and that is their highest and greatest good. And you know, Lord knows that that's clients who really, you know, on the landlord side could use, you know, good LLT litigation counsel. But the housing cooperatives sometimes need to reject people. So that's a function that they expect of us and that we rarely fulfill. But what are the other things that we can communicate to them that we might actually be helpful in, that they don't think lawyers do? Because many lawyers don't. And so some of that is the listening and the strategizing and taking the time for, you know, what does capacity building mean to them when they're working 2 to 3 other jobs just to like stitch things together and try to run their own organization, which is also something that's interesting to convey to students who don't understand why everybody doesn't like call them back immediately or make meetings immediately. And yeah, I didn't know it was GOCOD, but that's good. I'll try to remember it. It certainly is the framework we use for teaching counseling, and counseling is sort of a lot of this is like counseling big time. I think it's what good counseling is.
Yeah, when you said that, I hadn't, yes, that's the larger framework for all of this, is that counseling in an organizational context often can look different than an individual context. So yeah, that is helpful. So we, in addition to kind of thinking about the problem space or what the client is trying to do and how to maintain space for both that shifting over time, as well as what the solutions are shifting over time. It's like, how do we think about that from a power-based framework, in that grassroots organizations are often trying to shift power to achieve their goals. So Renee, you want to take that up?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I think working with power building organizations, there's no way that you can effectively lawyer with those organizations unless you have some framework or power analysis going into it, and just understanding, like, it's more packed into the context question. Like, what is the context in which your organization is operating? What are the things that they're facing, or what are the obstacles perhaps to achieving their ultimate goal? Right? And all of those things have to do with power. Lots of grassroots organizations essentially are trying to build power to actually get different, maybe law reform, maybe specific things, or resources from lots of different actors, government actors, whatever. And without understanding, I think, the power and the dynamics and relationships of the different actors who might be at play, and getting them to achieve whatever those goals are, I think it's really difficult to effectively counsel a client. So I just shared a few resources with Dorcas, both of which are nothing that I created, but I find them very helpful in just trying to think through and really do some power mapping and more deeply understanding, I think, the issues, but also the relevant actors. Right? So anytime we're trying to advance social change, right, there are typically more than one actor involved, right? So not just necessarily our clients, but sometimes it can be, for example, I don't know, city council, the mayor's office, zoning department, or it can be things like, I don't know, the school board, for example, you know, and organizations that are working on educational equity projects, right? But typically there are a number of different actors at play. And so trying to have some sense of who those actors are, what are their relationships to each other, and more importantly, like what are their relationships to your client and their ultimate goal. And so there's a project mapping worksheet that I find very helpful that was created by the Berkeley Law Policy Advocacy Clinic. And what it does is essentially kind of outline some questions to get you to think about really mapping out who those actors are, mapping out what their interests are. If their interests are aligned, might they be an obstacle for your client and what they're trying to achieve? What are the power dynamics? That is the part that I find so important, like the power dynamics between the various actors, because and all of these things I think take a certain level of commitment, not necessarily of just coming back with like legal answers, but also like just kind of engrossing yourself or really building a deeper relationship with your organizational client, right? And so these things aren't necessarily readily apparent. I want to recognize that as well. But recognizing that these power dynamics are at play are really going to help you to better advise the client. And so I find this helpful when starting on a new project that might be an ill-structured project, that might not be as straightforward, that might be a law reform project, might be a campaign to, I don't know, get some particular policy passed or achieve some specific goal. I could probably give a number of specific instances, but I just want to like offer it as a tool to get you to think about maybe in the context that you're working with, what that might look like and doing some of that mapping. And then if I could maybe just say briefly, or no, maybe I'll stop there. I think that makes sense. At some point, I just want us to talk briefly about creative lawyering and how important that is to, I think, this work. But I think I'll stop there in terms of power-based framework. And I guess I should also say, just in the way that I talk about it, think about it, I typically am talking to my students about like their clients who typically represent like the community or civil society and their relationship to the state, which might be the city, which might be whatever, and then also their relationship to other kind of corporate interests, which, you know, I make a distinction about our clients because they are more community-based, even though some of them might be for-profit. They are more grassroots enterprises, even if they are, and they typically have some social mission attached or are trying to achieve some kind of social change.
Renee, just a question. When you do the power mapping exercise or exercises, who do you do them with? With the students, with the clients, with the clients doing them with the students?
So I typically do them with the students, and this is mostly on our advocacy projects, which might be a direct representation, or might just be a partnership. But this is after not what I would refer to like an initial client meeting, but also some additional context that the client has given us. So there's been at least a couple of interactions between the students or student attorneys and the clients at this point, and really we've had time and opportunity to ask lots of questions about, you know, the project and that sort of thing. And then I have the students complete them, and then we discuss them, and they discuss them with the client.
Yeah, that was a good question, because I mean, as we think about the BALT cohort, it might be that we could integrate this kind of tool into the cohort, and then as we have cohort conversations or webinars, then the cohort could act in the same way that the class acts. In your example, Renee, to kind of build a shared analysis around the 4 organizations, and then of course informed by by the organizations themselves. So that's really helpful. So we only have 5 more minutes, actually. Time is going by. So what I would say is now is the time to talk about like creative lawyering. This is really the final slide, which is about common challenges and opportunities or advantages of representing organizations. And so I think creative lawyering to me is one of the advantages of organizational representation. I think there's a huge opportunity for thinking about both the tools you learn in law school and a lot of tools you don't learn in law school. And so what you all want to kind of share there? I think we talked a lot about challenges in terms of capacity and resources, time, et cetera. So let's focus on the opportunities, advantages.
I think I've already said this, but I think that there are lots of opportunities with this work. That's why I genuinely enjoy doing this work so much, is because that there's so much opportunity to be creative in working with organizational clients or doing kind of transactional work. We aren't necessarily confined in the same ways that you might be if you're in litigation or strictly using litigation as a tool, right? And you're in a court system with very defined like processes and procedures, and the limitations of that system are constantly in play, right? Doing transactional work with organizations who are doing movement building or who are doing like social change work, there's so much opportunity to be creative. That the other side of that is that it takes some unlearning, I think, for us as lawyers to get to fully embrace that. I know, at least from clients that I've worked with that are more grassroots organizations or that are doing movement building work, the biggest feedback or the most constant feedback that I always hear is that, well, the lawyer just told me what the law is, and that's not necessarily that helpful for me, right? Like, that's not what I'm looking for here. Even though I need to know what the law is, I need creative solutions to what we're trying to get done. And so that is a constant reminder to all of us, really, I think, to push beyond what we've learned in law school. And that necessarily just being able to put together a memo that recites what the current state of the law is not necessarily our work, and typically not always that helpful to our clients. There are ways in which we can use the current infrastructure of the law that can be useful, but there's so many, and I wonder if maybe, I don't know if examples would be helpful, but there are so many opportunities, I think, to be very creative in this work. And also sometimes
examples would be helpful.
Okay. So, I mean, the biggest one that I can think of, it feels like a small thing, but, one of the things that kept coming up for us working with worker co-op clients was that, well, there's not really a great statute in the state of Illinois for co-op clients to use in which they'll receive additional benefits. Part of that was that there were many concerns around the current co-op law, specifically for undocumented folks who wanted to be owners or worker owners in our co-ops. And so instead of kind of just dealing with what the law currently says, we basically embarked on a law reform project that got a new worker co-op bill passed that is much more suited for all the things that people want to do and make sure that everyone can, fully participate and be worker owners if they want to start worker co-ops. So that's just one example. But I mean, I think there are lots of really wonderful examples of this work in which lawyers are being very creative, even with what the law currently says. And so I just want to push this to think about that. I think sometimes we get so boxed in by what exists or what we've heard, and there's lots of lawyers who sometimes just take everything at face value. That's not, I think, what you need to be successful in this work. And so the other handout I'll just mention that I provided is from, I think it's called the Innovators Toolkit, but it's kind of fancied around like design thinking and has been used by lawyers to really think beyond what's the straightforward answer around a particular legal issue. It's called the Scamper framework, in which it gives a number of prompts in which you can kind of think beyond what you might what's not so readily apparent. How do we think creatively? How do we go beyond what is currently in the box or what's currently the state of the law?
Great. And Susan, do you have anything you would like to add to that in terms of thinking about creative lawyering?
No, I think I'm good. I think I like those tools. I like the idea. I guess not to be afraid to be creative, not to be afraid to encourage students to be creative, I think is important.
Yep. And so we're ending. And so I'm wondering, Deb, is there anything, I know we've talked previously about like creative lawyering and the law being a framework that can be very limiting at times. Is there anything you would add at the end?
I can't think of anything at the moment. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. Definitely put you on the spot. So what I would just say is that part of this work for BALT and for our contribution, hopefully, to communities is for lawyers to actually be of service in power building efforts, right? And that part of that means that what we're used to doing is probably not always the most useful thing, because if it was, then the conditions wouldn't exist that we're trying to address, right? Because lots of us have been at this for a long time. And it's not for fault of being smart or having tools that we're using to the best of our abilities, but it might actually be the tools themselves, right? It might actually be that we need new approaches, new ways to work with clients to achieve their goals. And often the clients know that better than we do, and are trying to achieve things that are outside of what our comfort zone is. And so how can we continue to be supportive and marshal the skills, knowledge, capital that we have to be of service to that? So that's our large, long-term political project. And we thank you for joining us on this journey. Thank you, Renee and Susan, for being willing to give up some time to talk today.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye. Get out of here.